Welcome to the program, and today is a red letter day because we have with us Nick Pope. I think when I asked ChatGPT recently who the top UFO experts on the internet were, I think Nick was number one, or he was in the top two or three, but I think number one, Nick, I think you made that. Of course, Nick ran Britain's MOD program to investigate UFOs. He's a journalist. He's an author. He's a TV personality who has been on many, many programs. If you watch cable news at all, you're apt to bump into him anytime, especially these days with everything going on. And he's also part of Ancient Aliens and Ancient Aliens Live. And I'm sure he'll tell us about that as well. And certainly I've already got my tickets for his Cleveland appearance. So I'm looking forward to it, and had the pleasure to go on a cruise with him and some other folks this last spring in late May. So good to spend some time with him and hear all the exciting updates of UFOs, UAPs, and his thoughts on those. Nick, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be on the show.
So let me ask you this. We got together at the end of March, and there was a lot of discussion for the folks that attended the cruise, some behind the scenes discussion that we had. It seems like to me, man, a lot has happened in the last 3 months. A ton has happened in the last 3 months.
Absolutely. It's further solidified, I think, the transition of this subject from fringe to mainstream. We've had, I guess, the big story is the David Grush whistleblower revelations, seeming to confirm a lot of things which previously were regarded as being on the fringe, even for this subject. I mean, literally crashed spaceships, dead pilots, that sort of thing. And not just idle chatter in conspiracy forums and things, but talk within Congress now about this. And as we speak, whether it's the Senate or the House, and whether it's the Armed Services Committees or the Intelligence Committees or the Oversight Committees, Congress wants to know about this. Not just the great David Grush story, but the other parts of the puzzle too, because he's one of a number of whistleblowers. So we've got that. We've got the NASA study. We've got the Pentagon study, of course, and we've got people beginning to think about the UFO-related language that's going to go into the next defense bill. We've got it in the current one and the previous one, but now people are thinking about National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024. So as you say, it's all happening.
So let me ask you this. I've always felt, particularly in the last few years, that there are elements, because a lot of times when we talk about the government, people tend to think, oh, the government is a monolith. It's one thing. And I don't believe that at all. The government is made up of people with different agendas, different beliefs, different motivations. I think there's certainly a group in the government that is still very much kind of holding on to the idea of, we know what we know, and you, by the American public, don't need to know. I think that faction's still very strong. But I also think you look at Gillibrand, you look at Rubio, you look at people within the government at high positions who do want to get out an appropriate amount of information. Obviously, probably not everything can be disclosed because of national security. It seems like to me, for a while there, the people that wanted to keep a lid on this were kind of regaining traction. And it was starting to get back into, let's recookify, I call it, recookify UFOs and UAPs. But with this latest Grush accusation or assertion, whatever it might be, it seems like now the pro-information, dare I say disclosure forces have regained maybe the advantage. What do you think about that analysis, and what are your thoughts on where things lie in that regard?
I think you're pretty much spot on. I mean, you're absolutely correct to talk about this factional struggle within the US government, within the military, within the intelligence community. I mean, that's absolutely a thing. And you're right. The advantage seems to ebb and flow when you look at any particular one part of it. I mean, on the one hand, you think of the UAP task force, which was set up to really take the lead on this, and predecessor body to Arrow, which currently has the lead. And you think Jay Stratton used to head that up. Travis Taylor used to be the chief scientist for it. David Grush used to be on it. So that's interesting, because the people who you would think would be at the heart of it and leading it were certainly, I would put them in the category of being in the believer faction, the disclosure faction, whatever you want to call it. Now all those people are now out of government. So on the one hand, I think things are happening, but that makes me wonder if they didn't give it their best shot within the system, still come up against roadblocks, and maybe feel that they couldn't progress it more outside of government. And it's interesting that Jay and Travis are now with Radiance Technologies, and Dave Grush. Well, he's got not only the fact that he's spoken to some people within Congress, but also he has an ongoing complaint with the Intelligence Community Inspector General, which is another complicating factor here. Frankly, it's a bit of a mess. And that has some advantages, that has some disadvantages. One of the disadvantages that when it comes to Congress trying to take this forward, you ask yourself who within Congress, House, Senate, which of the committees, which of the subcommittees, which of the personalities. At the moment, we're managing to keep it reasonably bipartisan. Is that going to last? Or is party politics at some point going to insert itself into this conversation? There's a lot up in the air right now, if you'll excuse the pun.
Now, I interviewed Ralph Blumenthal, one of the people who broke this story about Grush. And my feeling is that it didn't get enough play. I mean, we saw a lot on News Nation, and I thought they did a very nice job at presenting it. But I didn't see a lot on ABC. I didn't see a lot on NBC or CBS or, Fox in terms of Fox News has done a lot with covering this subject, including with yourself. But I guess what I'm saying is that instead, what I saw floated was that Las Vegas case, which seemed kind of dubious to me. Now, I'm not saying it was a hoax, but it didn't seem like that should be the lead item about UFOs. The lead item should have been the Grush case on every network newscast. Why do you think we didn't see it? Why do you think that the New York Times or the Washington Post didn't run this story instead of the debrief? And my friend Micah over there and Chrissy Newton, everyone, I give them great credit, but this should have been in the New York Times. This should have been in the Washington Post. Why do you think the top level mainstream old school media seemed resistant to this story?
Well, I'm sure that the story was certainly offered to the Times and the Post and the Hill and Politico. And yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think their position was that they could take in terms of fact checking, they could take the story up to a certain point, but no further. They could certainly take it to the point where they had or could have had Dave Grush checked out. And he certainly is who he says he is, and did what he said he did in terms of serving on the UAP task force. And there were people that could have and did verify that. But of course, by his own admission, a lot of what he was told was really just secondhand in that sense. So I have some sympathy with the Times and the Post and the others, because they don't want to end up with egg on their face here. And this is challenging. So, I mean, it's great that News Nation went all in on this and continuing to do so. There's a lot of politics with a small p on this, and the big mainstream news media outlets are certainly watching this, tracking it very closely, but they don't want to jump in just yet. So they have what I would call a watching brief on this. And the moment it kind of goes over the line in terms of, and whether that's something from Congress or whether it's something from the intelligence community inspector general that verifies some of Grush's claims, I don't know. But the moment it goes over the line, I think they will jump on this. But for the moment, they're being cautious. Again, we mentioned the factional struggle for narrative control. Sometimes that plays itself out through a sort of proxy war, fought through various journalists who have been given on background briefings on some of this material. And we're seeing that for sure. So again, it's a very difficult situation. I think it's not as good as it could be, but it's better than it might have been, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think on the whole, this subject is getting a lot more deserved visibility that it really needs and calls for. One thing that came to light recently that I was not familiar with was this idea of an Italian situation in, I believe, 1933, the idea that there had been a crash in Italy and a craft had been recovered. There's even documents that have been suggested that are legitimate. Of course, we don't know if they're legitimate or not. But what do you know and what do you think about this? Because to me, you always think Roswell, which is rightfully a very important case. But this 1933 case, I'd not heard of it, and I know a lot of other people who are interested in the subject hadn't heard of it. What do you know, and what do you think about this this new to many of us revelation?
Well, I had heard this, and in fact, I think I'd even done a TV show on it at some point. I mean, I think this was colloquially called the Mussolini files because it was tied up with wider UFO-related investigations by the fascist regime in Italy in the early 30s. And the Italian researcher Roberto Pinotti had certainly done a lot of research into this. I think obviously with a lot of these sorts of cases, the language problem means that people in the US and the UK and elsewhere haven't heard as much about this as they might have done. But frankly, I don't know what to make about it. I do recall Lou Elizondo has mentioned it before. And I think people like Chris Mellon are aware of it, and obviously Leslie Kane and others, and Ralph Blumenthal too. I'm not an expert on it, so it just goes into, I'll steal Stanton Friedman's phrase, it goes into my grey basket. But it is interesting, and again, of course, there's a lot more to the story than just the apparent recovery of this craft. There's the alleged involvement of Catholic Church, the acquisition of this craft in the tail end of the war by the US government with the Catholic Church and the Vatican acting as a sort of intermediary. And again, one wonders, when one looks at the statements of the Catholic Church in recent years, a lot of people say, do they know something about this? I mean, it was 2007, 2008, I think, that the then director of the Vatican's observatory gave a landmark interview where he said there's no doctrinal objection to the existence of alien life because, as he put it, man may place no creative limits upon God.
That's a good point. Almost sounds like someone who may know a little bit, something a little deeper. Now, going back to the Grush revelation or supposed revelations, the way it was phrased, non-human craft, I think many of us who are interested in this subject always attach ET, alien, from other planets. But the fact he didn't say ET craft, he didn't say alien craft. He said non-human craft. Maybe have many of us been maybe a little too narrow in our thinking, and maybe what we're dealing with here is not ET, but interdimensional or something else?
Yeah, absolutely. He's used the phrase non-human craft. He's also used NHI, non-human intelligence, to talk about whoever or whatever is behind this. I think, yeah, sometimes researchers are a little too quick to seize on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And when anyone with an intelligence or counterintelligence background who's been involved in this subject speaks, you always listen to what they say, what they don't say. They choose their words very carefully. Every time you think they've made a little slip, people like me look and say, well, you know, they don't really make a slip. They want certain things out there. And I think this is very deliberate. And yeah, there are a number of competing theories here. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, sure, but also the sort of ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the idea that we might share this Earth with another intelligence, a sort of shadow biosphere kind of argument. Also, you mentioned interdimensional, and then the ideas of time travelers from the future, or even a demonic interpretation of this. And then one thinks back to the first preliminary assessment published by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in June 2021 about UFOs, not entities, but you'll recall that they said, look, there's unlikely to be a single neat answer to this mystery. And it may be that when we're talking about whether it's craft or entities, there isn't one thing that explains this, but maybe things going on in parallel, including parallel universes, maybe. Now,
some people within the government, I've heard it said, and I think I've heard you comment on it, if I'm remembering correctly, there is, and if I'm wrong, forgive me, that there's a faction maybe within government that believe these are demons of some type and that we shouldn't mess with this because it is at its root evil, this phenomena?
Yes, I've come across this in the British government. Lou Elizondo has certainly come across it in the UK. I remember him giving an interview one time when he was speaking to someone very senior and trying to get more engagement on this. And the person waved him away and said, go read your Bible. Yeah, absolutely. There's a passage in the Bible, and it's in the book of Ephesians, and it uses the phrase to describe Satan. It uses the phrase, the prince of the power of the air. And on the basis of, pretty much on the basis of that single quote, a group of people, both in the UK, the US, elsewhere, one assumes, have kind of convinced themselves that some of this is demonic. And as you say, that therefore one shouldn't study it, because studying with it is engaging with it, which feeds it in terms of energy and attention. Whereas the thinking is that if it's a demon, you should ignore it, turn your back on it. And so now I don't subscribe to this theory myself, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that some people within government do. And that's interesting, because what it means is when you think about government pushing back against engagement on UAP, you tend to think, well, that means government's really skeptical, hard-nosed scientific skeptics. But that's not necessarily the case. There's some of that, for sure. But some of the pushback is from people who think it's very, very real, but it's demonic. And yeah, that's absolutely something that we have to contend with.
Now, in terms of the question of non-human craft, are you convinced, maybe not just through Grush, but your other work, do you believe that the U.S. government and potentially other world governments are in possession of, quote, non-human craft?
I don't know. I think it's a strong possibility, and certainly, Grush is not the only person within the system saying this, hinting at this, and there's very often in these sorts of situations, no smoke without fire. But speaking personally, I've seen no smoking guns, so I'm still undecided on that. I mean, sometimes one gets the impression that even the US government doesn't quite know what it's dealing with. But on other occasions, yeah, you get the impression, or some people come out and say that they know exactly what they're dealing with. But then you get this suggestion that it's not necessarily the government, that maybe the government's lost control of it. Maybe it sits now in the private sector, maybe as a way to take it further outside of the Freedom of Information Act and congressional scrutiny. They hid it away through initially contracts with defense corporations, aerospace companies. We've all heard the names bandied around of where people think this might be. Some people are now drafting language for the new defense bill, talking about amnesties. Ross Coulthart gave that interview where he used, I think, the phrase, that the corporation was trying to divest itself of a craft. There's such a lot, so many pieces to this puzzle. Frankly, it's difficult to know what to think sometimes.
No, I agree with that. I think that's spot on. And I appreciate when somebody in your position says, I don't know, because I think there's a lot of people who don't know who say that they do know. But I think that there's enough smoke and enough going on that there's really something to this. Now, I want to talk to you about secrecy, because you have kind of the unique perch, having worked for a government ministry at a high level. I believe that not everything about everything should be disclosed. I think there are legitimate reasons that there should be state secrets. It just makes sense. And I think that when somebody says, let's blow open the doors and tell everybody everything we know, I think there's good reasons not to do that. On the other hand, when you look at something like, I believe the Biden administration recently kind of restricted access to some of the JFK files on the assassination in '63. That's ridiculous because we're talking about something that happened almost literally 60 years ago. If you look at intelligence collection and a lot of different things, I can't think of anything that is really legitimately a secret unless somebody or something is being protected. Somebody doesn't want that information out. So I think I can see both sides of the coin. Where do you fall on the question of disclosure? Where that line is, how much the government should tell us and how much the government is justified in hiding from us?
It's a really interesting question. And I mean, before I get into disclosure, on secrecy more generally, I should say yes. I mean, I think sometimes secrecy is just the basic instinct of people who work in government, and particularly the parts of government where things are sensitive and national security and defense issues come into play. So that's one thing. Sometimes there is a tendency to overclassify things, and sometimes there's a tendency to misclassify things, kind of saying that it's about national security when in reality it's about political embarrassment, for example. That said, there are, and I can think of one very interesting example of something that you would think would have been declassified years ago, but stayed secret for decades. And it's the breaking of the Enigma codes during the Second World War. People now kind of think that, it all came out immediately after the end of the Second World War. That's not true. It was actually the late 60s, early 70s when it was revealed that we'd broken the Enigma cipher machine codes. And what the reason for that was that some embassies, particularly countries in South America, were still using those German machines. In the 50s, in the 60s, and the West, we were reading their mail. So, of course, there was a very good reason not to disclose that. And I throw that in as an example of something which is slightly counterintuitive. But again, with all this, people say, the American people have a right to know. One of my favorite phrases is, well, when you tell the American people, you also tell the government in Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and everywhere. So you've got to be careful with this sort of thing. Now, specifically on disclosure, it depends what there is to disclose. If it's just that there's an alien presence, you would think, well, there's not anything inherently classified about that in and of itself, even though aspects of it, for example, the technology behind the craft, might be classified, because almost everything, you wouldn't want China or Russia to get their hands on that. And particularly bearing in mind that anything that you would use in terms of interstellar travel likely involves vast amounts of energy, and anything that's high energy can be weaponized. So there might be aspects that you would keep back. But again, one wonders, couldn't you compartmentalize that and say, yeah, look, we're not alone. There's an alien presence, but we're not going to tell you about the craft, or at least about the mechanics of it for that reason. Which makes me wonder, is it something else? Is there, and again, I've used this phrase before, but I use it for a reason. Is there a secret too terrible to be told about a non-human presence? And I don't know what that would be, but I mean, the obvious one is they made us, and that there would be something which would be such a profound shock to us that maybe these kind of cliches about panic in the street and undermining all the global religions would turn out to be true. So is there some aspect of this that would be so profoundly unsettling? And I'm going to say something controversial here, just to put the cat amongst the pigeons. But up until a few years ago, I was very kind of, I was a believer in societal resilience. And then COVID hit, and it made me rethink. And I thought, governments, public health institutions, the media, big tech, a lot of the public just panicked and didn't handle COVID well at all. We all remember the absolute hysteria. Now, whatever the threat, there's no good panicking. No good decisions are ever made as a result of panic. So I look at COVID and I look back and I wonder, are we ready for some big ontological shock, something that would totally rethink our view of who we are or what our place is in the cosmos? I'm not sure we are ready.
Also, what if they're not good guys? I mean, I think there's a contingent amongst people who are, let's say, UFO aficionados, if that is a valid phrase, who think, they're our space brothers and they're going to lead us to enlightenment. And it's always, at least if you look at humanity, when you have a technologically superior civilization come into contact with a technologically less advanced civilization, the results always turn out bad for that technologically less advanced civilization. Now, let's say that these are ET or these are alien. By definition, the fact they're visiting here makes them more advanced than us. I mean, maybe they've hit a state of enlightenment and maybe they have figured out that peace is the way and they're so much more spiritually advanced and much more intelligent. But based on human history, I wouldn't put any money on it. So could part of the concern be that, we found out that at least some of these, whatever they are not friendly?
Absolutely. And in all of this, let's just suppose for a moment we're talking about the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's not going to, I can't conceive of a universe where there are just two civilizations, us plus one. Far more likely, there's a whole bunch of civilizations out there, and therefore one would suspect that there's a spectrum of morality, goodness, whatever you want to call it, and that some of those other civilizations would not necessarily have our best interests at heart, or would be cool and indifferent say. I mean, to use an analogy, if, when the farmer moves the cattle around between the fields every now and then, he doesn't consult the cows. So
right.
We may be in that situation. But again, I've quoted Lou Elizondo a couple of times. Another interview of his, which is very thought-provoking, is when somebody said to him, if you could sum up how people might feel about this if they knew what you knew, and you could put it into one word, what word would you use? And he said somber. So I think, yeah.
Wow. Maybe ignorance is bliss after all, Nick, Now, I want to ask you about this because it's somewhat controversial as we wind down here. Some people have said, look at Nick Pope, look at other people who are the voices of authority on UFOs, and there's disinformation here and those kind of things. And I know that kind of stuff floats out there, so I want to give you the opportunity to respond to it.
Yes. I mean, one very high-profile individual in the UFO community made this accusation literally, I think, again, 2 days ago, not for the first time, and said, I'm paraphrasing, but effectively said that people like Christopher Mellon, Luis Elizondo, and myself are, I think he used the phrase, counterintelligence and or disinformation officers, agents, talking up the threat narrative in the media. Well, that's I can only speak for myself, of course. That's not true. I no longer work for the British government or any other government in any capacity, but I'm, how could I prove it? You can't prove a negative. So in a way, these accusations are kind of insidious because I could never prove that I wasn't still secretly on the payroll. As for the threat narrative, I've made no secret of the fact that it is my view that it is better to assume that there is a threat or a potential threat and then be relieved if that threat does not materialize. That's a better strategy than assuming everything's going to be all benign and friendly and then getting caught out if it isn't. And I make no apologies for that. I think it's a common sense approach. It's certainly the default position of anyone who's ever done any contingency planning in government or the military or the intelligence agencies. When you look at contingency plans, better to have a plan and not need it than need it and not have it. So I see where these accusations come from, but frankly, I think they're baseless.
On a more pleasant subject, I want to talk to you about a couple of your projects. One you were talking to me a little bit about on the cruise was the After Contact project. Talk to us about that, because that seems like something folks would want to definitely check out.
Sure. Well, when this subject started its transition from fringe to mainstream, I thought we waste such a lot of time in skeptic versus believer dogfights about the true nature of the UFO phenomenon. I said, I'd like to do a project where we just assume that it's all real. Let's settle on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So my idea was for a TV series that starts with the idea that this is all real and it's a done deal. And 3 words then come to mind, a question. What happens next? So After Contact is a TV series that I made for Billy Carson's Forbidden Knowledge TV network. And we've filmed 2 seasons so far, 6 episodes each. Each episode is a deep dive with me as the host, doing a one-on-one interview with a specialist in a particular field. So we take a theme. It might be politics, religion, science, technology, the economy, artificial intelligence. Each episode on one of those themes, and we just drill down into it. And it's interesting, but we have some fun with it too. because in a sense, there are no right or wrong answers. So I got to interview some wonderful, wonderful people. Bridget Samuels, who's a neuroscientist. We talked about linguistics. Could we communicate with another civilization? Hakeem Olusei, an astrophysicist. Robert Wallace, retired CIA. Tracy LaTourette, former, fast jet pilot. Robin Hanson, the economist. So many great people. So, After Contact was just this really, speculative what if show about what would happen after we have open contact with other civilizations.
And it's really interesting thought experiment just to kind of noodle around on the different things that could happen. What if they brought new technology to the fore? What if they solved, the changing of the climate? What if they brought us new energy sources? It kind of reminds me of that old Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man. Just hopefully we wouldn't be on the menu. Where can people check that out if they want to see those episodes and any possible ones forthcoming?
It's all on Billy Carson's Forbidden Knowledge TV network. And for subscribers, it's free. And for those who aren't subscribers, people can take out a free trial. And they can watch some or as many of the episodes as they like. And at the end of their trial period, they can either dip out or stay in. But there's lots of other great content. So Billy Carson's Forbidden Knowledge TV.
And then something I'm going to be attending and in the audience eagerly watching. Actually, I just got my tickets November 2nd in Cleveland, my market. You're going to be with the rest of the gang, Ancient Aliens Live. And I know you're doing that across the country. Just talk to me about the tour and what people can expect if they turn out and how they can get their tickets.
Well, Ancient Aliens is, of course, such a smash hit TV show. I mean, it's people love it, and it's been going for so many seasons. So a while ago, it was decided let's turn it into a 90-minute live stage show with some of the best known contributors from the show. And there's Giorgio Tsoukalos, of course, David Childress, William Henry, Dr. Travis Taylor, and myself. Travis isn't in some of the promo pictures because when he's filming for Skinwalker Ranch, he has to dip out. But he's so I think there are some shows in the fall where he won't be there, but then he'll be back later in the fall, and that's always great to have him. And we have fun with it. It's 90 minutes. We show some clips from the show. We talk about some of our favorite sites all around the world that we've visited, theories, new developments. We also, I have to say, have a little bit of fun at each other's expense from time to time. When you go on the road with people, you inevitably bond much more than you do when you just in and out of a TV studio. And there's a little bit of banter, shall we say. We've done, I think, about 21 shows so far. We got another, I think it's 12 or 14 lined up for the fall. We're already thinking about early next year as well. Really great that you'll be coming along. Looking forward to seeing you. And people, ancientalienslivetour.com for more details and tickets.
And then I would just ask you, is there anything else that you're really excited about it that you're doing now that you'd like to share with folks, and how people can basically tune into everything Nick Pope and follow everything you do?
Well, I'm pleased to be going back to the UK for the first time in several years, actually, in a few weeks' time for Awakening Expo 2023. And I'm going to be sharing a stage with people like James Fox, Caroline Corrie, Melissa Tittle, Billy Carson, a lot of others. So that's going to be really interesting and fun, and great to be back in the old country, Manchester, UK. Looking forward to to having a curry somewhere and a few pints of English beer for sure. A great company as well there. So Awakening Expo 2023. Aside from that, my website is nickpope.net. My Twitter is @nickpopemod, and I try to put new things on there as they occur. And of course, it's going to be a fascinating summer coming up. We've got the next NASA report is due. I think the Pentagon's Arrow office is due to make another report to Congress. We may or may not get congressional hearings the next round this summer. It might slip to the fall. Watch this space. So again, lots going on. And of course, the biggest thing of all is that, as we saw with the David Grush story, I think the real news are going to be things that come suddenly and unexpectedly from left field. And so again, you get up in the morning, you boot up the computer, you just never know what's going to have dropped. Amazing times.
Yeah, may you live in interesting times. And one of the people that make these times interesting on the UFO UAP subject is always Nick Pope. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thanks, Jim.